Okay, I'm going to go over these genetics problems with you in sections. You may have noticed that the way these genetics problems are set up, it's kind of backwards from what you did in Biology 1, where you were given parents and you set up a Punnett square to find out what the offspring were. So things are going to be a little different in AP Biology. We use percentages or probabilities a little bit more, and it actually makes solving these problems easier. I hope you watched the first video that I sent out about genetics and that you know the ratios that you're expected to memorize, the 3 to 1, the 1 to 1, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1, and 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. You need to know what parents those ratios indicate. Also, whenever I work a problem, if I don't make a Punnett square, you're always free to make a Punnett square. It just takes time, but if you need more practice with genetics problems, then by all means make Punnett squares. I'll have some suggestions for you though when you get to the dihybrid crosses, so you don't have to make those gigantic Punnett squares. All right, this first one is just based on your prior knowledge about Mendel. He came up with 3 laws of genetics, basically to explain what he saw with the data that he collected from pea plants. And we'll get into this a little bit more later, so this was just kind of seeing if you had an idea of some of this vocabulary. And what Mendel was able to come up with, he figured out dominance, he figured out segregation. Segregation describes how genetically, when the parent alleles kind of come together, they separate independently of one another. We'll talk about that with meiosis. Independent assortment is part of segregation. We'll talk about that later with meiosis. So if that's one that you weren't sure of, just hold off on that. We'll get to meiosis later. The next one, dominant traits are always more common. You're always going to think when you see the word always, but most people do think that dominant traits are more common in the population than recessive traits, but that's false. Just an example, 6-fingeredness is actually a dominant trait, and that's obviously not more common. Blood type O is the recessive phenotype for blood type, and it's definitely not less common. All right. So for this one, both your parents get migraines, but you don't. So you know that getting a migraine must be dominance. So for that one, first of all, you have to assume that migraine is caused by a single gene, which it's not, but anyway. There's a couple ways you could have approached this. If both of your parents get migraines, but you don't, one way you could look at it is this. If it's a dominant trait, and both your parents have it, we don't know their entire genotype, but we do know that they have a dominant allele since they get migraines. And both of your parents get migraines, so both of them at least have a dominant allele. And we know that you don't get migraines. So if you don't get migraines and migraines is dominant, that means that not getting migraines must be recessive. So the way you get this individual is that both parents are heterozygous for the trait. And just to kind of illustrate how migraines couldn't be, with this instance here, could not be a recessive trait. If getting migraines was recessive and both parents got migraines, both parents would look like this, homozygous recessive. That's the only way to have a recessive trait expressed. There's no way to get a dominant allele out of that for you to not have it. So the answer to that one is true. All right, the inside of the Punnett square. So when you make a Punnett square from a cross, let's say we're doing this cross right here, big A little a cross with big A little a. What you're putting on the outside of your Punnett square are the gametes. So if you're big A little a, when meiosis occurs to create sperm and egg, this individual could contribute a big A to to the egg or a little a to the egg. And this individual could contribute a big A to the sperm and a little egg to the sperm. Then the combinations that you see inside, those are the possible genotypes of your offspring. Okay, so the answer is, it shows the possible offspring. That doesn't mean it's going to come out in that exact ratio, but that's the possible. All right, what does dihybrid mean? Di means two. Hybrid technically means the same thing as heterozygous. So technically, dihybrid would look like this. It's a two-trait cross where both parents are heterozygous for both traits. But in a generic sense, we just kind of use that term to talk about looking at two traits at one time. Now, we haven't talked about pedigrees, but you did talk about it in biology. And I'll give you a few rules when we get to pedigrees. But basically, when you're looking to see if a pedigree is dominant or recessive, look for two parents who have an offspring who is different from them. So for example, we've got these two parents right here, and they have an offspring with this condition. So when in a pedigree, when things are shaded, that means that they have that trait. When they're not shaded, they don't have the trait. So if this is a recessive trait and these people don't have it, that means that they have a dominant allele. And if their offspring does have it and it's recessive, if it's a recessive condition, then parents can contribute a recessive allele to their offspring. So these parents don't have the condition, but their offspring does. And again, just like I showed you earlier, it wouldn't work the other way around. So we know that this particular trait is recessive in nature. All right, we're going to go through to 11, I think. Yes. All right, so here are some crosses in peaches. Now, here's what I recommend when you are doing genetic crosses. Before you do anything else, make a key, even if it takes a couple extra seconds, and write out the parent cross. So for here, it says the gene for fuzzy is dominant to the gene for smooth. So always make out a key first, and then take care of your parent cross. Write it out where you can see it. Two trees with fuzzy fruit are crossed. The offspring are in a ratio of 942 to 298, fuzzy to smooth. What are the genotypes of the parents? So if both of the trees are fuzzy, fuzzy is my dominant trait. So write out what you know about the parents. If they have the fuzzy trait, we know they at least have a dominant allele for fuzzy. This could be big F, it could be big F, little f. Next, look at your data. This is roughly a 3-to-1 ratio. Whenever you have a 3-to-1 ratio, this is one of the ratios I told you to remember. When you have a 3-to-1 ratio, that means that your parents are heterozygous. So if you have that ratio memorized, you don't have to go through making a bunch of Punnett squares to figure this out. All right, number 8, the ability to taste PTC paper is carried by the dominant allele. So tasters have the dominant allele. That means non-tasters are recessive. You are a PTC taster. So if you are a PTC taster, we know that you have at least a dominant allele. Your brother is not. So we're going to kind of, if you see the way I lay this out, you're going to kind of make a pedigree with this. Your brother's going to be at the same level that you are. Parents are above in a pedigree. Parents are above. Siblings are right next to one another. So your brother is a non-taster. The only way he can be a non-taster is to have 2 little t's. That means he got a little t from mom and a little t from dad. We're trying to figure out what you are. The next thing it tells us is that your father is a taster. So dad is big T something. Your mother is not a taster, so mom is little t, just like the brother. So brother got one little t from mom, he had to get the other little t from dad. If you got one big T, you got it from dad. So that means that from your mom, you had to get a little t. So your genotype is big T, little t. All right. For number 9, in peas, yellow is dominant, and it doesn't even say what the other color is, but little yellow would be green. Even though it doesn't say that, that's what it is in peas. 2 yellow peas will always have yellow offspring. So is that true or false? Well, the answer is false, because I can have yellow peas that are heterozygous, and then each parent can contribute a little Y, and you end up with whatever the other color is, the recessive color. So that's false. Also in peas, purple is dominant to white. So purple, little p would be white. And when you're using letters that look the same, like Y's and P's, exaggerate the big one and the little one so that they look very different when you're doing your crosses. So in a large field of peas that have all come from the same parents, half have purple, half have white. So here's just you can do the Punnett squares if you want, but if you end up with a 1-to-1 ratio, which that is half purple, half white, you should know that a 1-to-1 ratio is always going to be a heterozygous crossed with homozygous recessive. If your phenotype ratio, your trait ratio, is 1-to-1, these were your parents. This parent was purple, this parent was white. So there's that answer. And finally, a purple flowered pea that is heterozygous for color, so heterozygous for purple, is crossed with another purple pea that is homozygous. So this one's homozygous for purple. That means he has 2 big P's. What is the genotype ratio of the offspring? So you can do a Punnett square if you want, but you can also remember or notice that this parent can only contribute a big P. So it doesn't matter what this parent contributes. You're always going to have that big P, meaning that all of them will have that dominant genotype. So, so the answer is none of these. They'll all have a phenotype purple. All right, I'll make a separate video for the next set of problems.